And let's get our Bibles. We're going to be looking at several passages this morning, but let's start in Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10. We've been doing this series for the last couple weeks called What Jesus Did Do. Not what Jesus would do, but what Jesus did do. And we've been studying His words and actions, especially as it relates to dealing with difficult people in difficult situations. The reason we're doing this is because He left us a perfect example. And as we go through life and as we deal with situations and we deal with people that just are a challenge and just cause us stress and cause us difficulty, we don't want to react out of our flesh, right? We don't want to respond in anger and frustration and hostility. We want to respond in a godly way. We want to show the love of Christ just like He showed to us. Because while we were yet sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. We were enemies. We were opposed to God. That's what the whole Old Testament shows. That man was opposed to God, rebelled against God, didn't want to do it God's way, didn't want to follow His law, didn't want to trust Him. And He gave every opportunity after every opportunity. And our heart as humans, our sin nature, is to push back against that. So God did this for us. He showed us kindness. He showed us mercy and grace and love. And He was willing to forgive while we were anti-God. So, as believers who have been transformed, as believers who have received His nature, now our response to difficult people and people that are putting us in difficult situations is not to go back to who we once were. It's to live redeemed lives and to respond like Jesus did. That's why we're doing this series. Now, we've dealt with a couple things so far. We dealt with people who are critical, and we've dealt with people who are kind of hard to love. This morning, our study focuses on what may be the most challenging person to interact with. The people they're going to cause us the most stress and the most grief. It's someone who is really proud and arrogant. Someone who is really proud and arrogant. And I want to get this right out there at the start, okay? Every person in this room is proud. In fact, I want us to say it out loud with full gusto, okay, Dot? I am proud. No, I want us to yell it. Will you do that this morning? Get a little energy now? All right, so on the count of 3, we are all going to say, I am proud, okay? 1, 2, 3, go. I am, yes, you are, and so am I. We all are proud. So in studying this morning, we're not looking down our noses. We're not being judgmental. We're not being condescending and say, well, that person's proud and everybody I deal with proud, but I'm not proud. No, we're all proud. You just admitted it. So let's start from that point. It's true of all of us because we're born with a sin nature. We have this proud arrogance, this attitude in us, just as human beings who are marked by sin, that infects us. And that started back with the devil before we were ever created, because in his pride and his arrogance, he was one of the top angels, and he in his pride decided that he was going to try to usurp God and ascend above God, and he took a third of the angels with him to challenge the authority in a heavenly coup d'etat. So it starts with him. Then when that failed and he got cast out of heaven, that defeat kind of incited his pride even more. So he looked at God's creation and he saw man created in God's own image, and he went right after us. The first temptation was also to rebel against God. It was to be proud and to say, I don't need God. I don't need all that God's given me. I'll be my own God. And it's not surprising that he worked through the serpent, because Genesis 3 says the serpent was more crafty than any other animal. He was able to speak and reason. So the devil goes to the serpent and he tempts man to do exactly what he had tried to do against God. And then when Adam and Eve committed that sin that we all would have committed, that we're all culpable for, the one that corrupted our souls, then the pride of mankind just continued. And it led to excuses about what had happened. There was no responsibility. Remember, Adam says, well, Eve gave me the fruit. And Eve says, well, the devil gave me the fruit. And the devil doesn't even take He doesn't even try to blame somebody else. He knew what he was doing. He was happy about it. All of this was centered on pride. So not one of us in this room, myself included, myself especially, is excluded from the infection that is the underlying root cause of sin. Okay? The underlying root cause of sin is pride. But there are going to be people that we're going to run into where pride and arrogance is a chronic and defining characteristic of who they are. It's not just, well, yeah, I'm kind of proud and I know I've got an ego. No, we're going to run into people where it's who they are. And that type of pride is overt all throughout the Bible. We'll see that in a couple of minutes. But in terms of who Jesus dealt with, because remember, we're looking at Jesus' example, his direct example. He dealt with a lot of proud people. And it would be easy to pick the obvious one, right? The Pharisees. We've talked about the Pharisees and how the religious leaders had this attitude that they were better than everybody else. And they had changed the law and corrupted it. And they walked around with their robes and their phylacteries and their bells. And they look at us. So that would be the obvious one. But this morning, I want to concentrate on somebody that Jesus spent a lot of time with who was very subtly proud. In fact, he was so under the radar with his arrogance that even a lot of the disciples were fooled. Even all the way up until the Last Supper, when Jesus overtly calls him out, and the disciples still don't realize what's going on. You may have guessed who it is. It's Judas Iscariot. Never preached about Judas Iscariot, and we're going to study him this morning. So I want to encourage you, get a pen, get your bulletin, take some notes this morning, or if you have a little notebook. But we're going to study Judas this morning. And here's the thing that was interesting. My initial thought about the person that betrayed Jesus was that there would be a lot of text about him. So I was surprised when I went through the Gospels and I realized that over the 4 Gospels, there are only 6 specific texts about Judas. There are only 6 times across the Gospels, and there's some repetition between the Gospels. There are only 6 times when Judas is talked about. The first one is when he's called by Jesus. The second's when he criticizes Mary and Bethany. The third's when he goes to the chief priests to betray Jesus. The Bible says there he's filled with the devil. The fourth is at the Last Supper, where Jesus identifies him as the betrayer. The fifth is at Gethsemane, when he comes to arrest Jesus. And the sixth is when he is filled with regret and tries to give the money back and commit suicide. So there are only 6 times, the person who betrays Jesus, there are only 6 times in the Bible where he's talked about. Now, let's look at the first one, Matthew chapter 10. Let's start in verse 1. We're going to look at a couple texts, but this is where we'll begin. Matthew 10, verse 1. Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who's called Peter, Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Now, it's probably not surprising that Judas is listed last, right? But verse 1, if you look back at that, it holds a very unique detail that's actually a little bit surprising. Because it says that Jesus gave all of his disciples, all 12 of them, that includes Judas, he gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out, and authority and ability to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness, including Judas. We know about Simon Peter in Acts. We know about John in Acts. We know about what the disciples did. But Judas, as much as Peter, as much as John, as much as Andrew, as much as James, was given at this point, Matthew 10:1, the ability and the authority to cast out evil spirits and heal people. Now, a lot of people have debated over the years whether Judas was actually saved. Some people question whether it was possible because he betrayed Jesus, and he betrayed Jesus proudly and purposely and intentionally, and he took money for it. He prostituted himself to betray Jesus. So we look at that and we go, how could God accept him into heaven? How could he be saved like the rest of us? And yet there's another side of Judas early on. He's summoned by Christ. Apparently at this point he trusts Jesus because he's following him. And he's given power, verse 1, look at it, by Jesus to cast out demons, to heal people. He's the one who handles the money, even though Matthew probably has more experience as a tax collector, but they give the money to Judas. And then at the end, after he betrays Jesus, he deeply regrets it. There's great sorrow. He tries to give the money back, and because he's so broken by what he's done, he commits suicide because he can't handle the shame anymore. Now, we don't know, in the grand scheme of things, because we can't really know about anybody but ourselves, whether Judas was saved. But what we do know at this point, in verse 1, is that at the outset, he was one of them. At the outset, he had authority and power from heaven. So what happened? What happened? Judas really parallels the devil, because the devil was a top angel. The devil was one of the highest angels in heaven, and yet he fell out of his pride and out of his arrogance. And that seems to be what happens to Judas here. I wrestled this week with the words pride and arrogance because they're related. But arrogance really is more severe than pride, and it's more serious than pride. Arrogance really is pride at its extreme. Arrogance takes pride to the next level. And here's the dangerous thing about pride, because it takes a couple positions, about arrogance. It takes a couple positions that really get out over the skis, so to speak. So let's look at these. Arrogance is an over-exaggerated sense of personal worth and importance. It's an over-exaggerated sense of personal worth and importance. It's okay to be proud about things. If you're a good carpenter, it's okay to take pride in that. If you know how to cook like nobody's business, it's okay to take pride in that. If you're really good at sports or you're really good at business, that's okay. It's all right to have some sense of value and worth. But arrogance is over-exaggerated. It places greater worth and greater importance in our minds on what we really are. Then second, it takes an offensive attitude of superiority and condescension. So it goes beyond, wow, I'm really good at this, to now, I'm better than you. And looking down on people and talking down on people. And then third, it's an overbearing posture of having to be in control. And that can be very subtle. But really, when you get to this level of arrogance, the person's not bothered by that. They're not ashamed for you to know that. And it comes across as kind of demanding. Well, now I know what I'm doing, and I'm better than you, and I know what's right, so now I'm going to be in control, and you're just going to have to yield to that. And then fourth, it's an outraged reaction when people prove them guilty or wrong. And that manifests itself not in brokenness, and not in humility, but in anger and hostility and blame. And we see all of this in Judas. So pride is dangerous, but arrogance is lethal. And it strikes like a hidden snake that's just lying in the grass, waiting for weakness, waiting for an opening, waiting for an opportunity to bite and to just inject that venom of pride and of condescension into our hearts and our words and our actions and our relationships. And that's where pride and arrogance gets very, very dangerous. There are times when it's going to be obvious, but more often than not, it's going to be subtle. And arrogance likes to kind of quietly infiltrate our heart and mind, to sneak in, to just kind of work its way in, and it starts to alter our thinking, and it starts to demand attention, and it starts to crave control, and then it messes up our relationships. Pride and arrogance will do more damage to you than any other factor, including external or internal. It's just going to go after everything, and it is always going to be a danger to a church. Every church is at risk of this. Every church is at risk of arrogance and self-promotion. Why? Because the devil hates the church. Every marriage is going to be at risk of pride and arrogance. Why? Because the devil hates marriage. Every family is going to be at risk of this because the devil hates godly families. So we have to guard against this, because the enemy is not in any way reticent to try to make that happen. In fact, he lives for it. The whole goal of the enemy at this point is to knock us down. It's to drive us away from the Lord. It's to ruin our witness. It's to draw attention to ourselves so that Jesus doesn't get the glory. Now, how do I know that? Well, turn over to John chapter 12. Turn over to John chapter 12. This is one of the most beautiful scenes in the New Testament. Just an amazing moment of worship and praise and humility and honoring the Lord. And of course, because that's happening, the enemy goes after it. The enemy wants to ruin that. He wants to distract from that. So let's see what happens. John chapter 12, look at verse 1. Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany where Lazarus was. Bethany is about 1.5 miles outside of Jerusalem. Where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. That was in chapter 11. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, interesting term by the Spirit there, who was intending to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people?" There's always one, right? Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Therefore Jesus said, "Let her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with me, but you do not always have me." Now this is a really interesting scene. Because Lazarus has come back from the dead. Jesus has raised him from the dead 1 chapter before. And now they're sitting at the house in Bethany where Martha and Mary and Lazarus lived. They were all siblings. So they're at the house, and this is this amazing scene that Lazarus, who was dead for 3 days, now is sitting there eating dinner. And everybody's having a wonderful time, and they're fellowshipping, and the house is filled with laughter, and everything's great. And in the middle of that, Mary, one of the siblings, walks in and gets an expensive box or jar of perfume, and she proceeds to break it open and pour it on Jesus' feet and wipe it with her hair. This was a form of anointing. This was a form of worship for her. And the whole house is filled with the aroma. The dinner now, whatever they were eating, lamb or whatever, that's now gone by the wayside. Now the perfume just fills the house. Like if you've ever walked into a house where there are a bunch of essential oils, right? It's just like, whoa, okay. This was more than that, but it was wonderful. And you have this scene of Mary worshiping Jesus, and Jesus sitting there as she wipes his feet with her hair, and the perfume smelling, and she's praising him silently. And everybody, I think at that point, is filled with wonder. What is happening here? Except for one.